You're watching or listening to Private Members Club, and in this edition we're going to be talking about Gary Lineker, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
And I'm John.
So if we're talking about Gary Lineker, that is exactly what the government wants us to be doing, right?
Yes. Well, that's going to be my argument anyway.
Certainly.
Well, I mean, did Rishi Sunak go to France and not get a deal for the return of the immigrants back over onto French soil? And did his trip actually end up costing him £500 million? So is that not really what's going on here today?
It's an undeliverable policy. It's they want this issue as one of their key points for the next election, to ramp up their support so they can say something, and they can't do what they want to do about it. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, I heard it not put in as many words earlier in the week, but it was pointed out that they have had so many positions and new ideas about this over the last couple of years, and every time the numbers go up instead of going down, it just advertises to, you know, the planet as a whole that Britain's doors are open and the government's got no chance of shutting them whatsoever. So basically, every time they come up with an idea, it just anyway, Matt, tell us a little bit about the football that's been going on this week.
Well, I don't know much about it, but I don't think that much is going to be reported this weekend because everybody's boycotting Match of the Day, and it's decided they're not going to appear on it.
Actually, well, yeah, as we started before I started the call, the only one I'd heard about was Ian Wright, but have others joined?
Oh, Shearer? I mean, I'm imagining football's going to be presented by Matt Letizia at this rate.
By the sound of it.
Alex Scott has jumped off as well. She's in solidarity.
Yeah, good for them all. I'm
totally with them. And Jeremy Clarkson supports it as well. It's great.
Does he? Good for him, actually. Well, I mean, because he was allowed to tweet what he liked. Alan Sugar's allowed to tweet what he likes, right?
Yeah, Deborah Meaden as well. She can say anything. It's manifestly a stupid decision because everyone who's not BBC News staff has been able to treat explicitly what they like. In Sugar's case, explicitly political about don't vote Labour.
Well, I've got a little theory. Oh, go on, Matt. Sorry.
Andrew Neil, BBC right to agree new Lineker social media rules. Former BBC presenter who presents on the BBC at the moment, Andrew Neil, says the corporation is right to agree new rules with Lineker. It's not currently working, he tells Newscast podcast.
Wow.
So Andrew Neil thinks that BBC presenters should be impartial.
Does he indeed?
Which is
interesting.
Quite the irony.
Yeah, quite. Yeah. What was I going to say? Oh, I see the way it's been phrased, the idea of Gary Lineker stepping back. Do you know what would have been a really clever thing? And I'd love it if this were true. I doubt sincerely that it is, but as things stand, there's nothing to say that it isn't. I'd love it if Gary Lineker himself had taken the decision to step back, knowing that would throw the spotlight firmly back at the government and the higher echelons of the BBC. For after all, the government have been pointing the spotlight at him for the last couple of days. If he steps back away from it, but does so in such a fashion that it makes it look like it was them who pushed him, then the spotlight swings right back in their direction, does it not?
Well, yeah, and also they seem to want this issue, which is concentrated on their policy, being compared to Germany of the 1930s. It's not really a good idea, is it?
In fact, it didn't even, let's dig into this, because he didn't even actually compare the policy itself to Germany of the 1930s.
The language.
He compared the language.
The rhetoric, yes. The
rhetoric around it. And so this whole thing essentially is about propaganda, really, isn't it? Rather than about policy and stuff like that. And clearly, he wouldn't be wrong to compare the policy, because after all, what are this government doing if not herding tens of thousands of people into camps in the sort of southeast of the country and basically throwing away the key on those people who come to this country as refugees and have apparently, it seems, no legal right and no voice to say anything about the way they've been treated by this government. So I don't think he'd be miles off if he were to say it was the policy. But no, he said it was about the language.
Well, he's mildly wrong, because I think it's more the language of the 1920s that actually allowed the Nazis to actually come into power and build on what was there. So,
well, the early 30s. So he could
late
yeah.
20s, early 30s, yeah.
And he's been supported by historians of Weimar Germany who have said, yes, he's right. This is the language that, you know, obviously it was in Germany. It was in German in Germany in the 1930s, so it's not technically right. But it's Suella Braverman who's brought up the Holocaust, which this is
the Daily Mail, wasn't it?
Quite a long way away from talking about the Holocaust. And if he had talked about the Holocaust, then I think he would have correctly been censured and told off for tweeting that the government is like, you know, because that's not the case. But what he actually tweeted was pretty mild, and it turns out fairly accurate.
It was very well phrased.
Yeah. But it's a distraction.
Yeah, it is a distraction.
All a distraction. And actually, I think the government's perfectly happy every time Gary Lineker appears on the front pages. They're very happy that at the moment the BBC has Gary Lineker not presenting Match of the Day as a massive banner with one of their live news tickers going on the side, because that's just, the government needs kind of scapegoats, and they need somebody to fight because they're running out of successors. So it's this, or they invent trans issues in order to highlight those which don't actually exist and which aren't actually happening. And they create things like this, and then Twitter explodes. So Twitter is like chock-a-block with Gary Lineker this, Gary Lineker that, which gives the newspapers the excuse to present Gary Lineker as the front page news because it's the front page on Twitter, and it just keeps on cycling round and round. And meantime, Sunak can humiliatingly give, as JR pointed out, £500 million to France, which I think his predecessors had refused, and had been a big thing in the Conservative Party of not giving money to France.
They've given some. I think they've given about something like 100 million, and they were expecting today to be another 60. I think was the figure that they were talking about. They weren't expecting it to be 500.
I mean, 500 million is I think it's. I mean, in some ways, Sunak is more of a sort of prime minister who I would like than Johnson or Truss, but the bar is pretty low.
He's more emollient, isn't he? He will negotiate rather than shout at the foreigners like they're in a bar going.
Yeah. Giving 5 million to France isn't the sort of thing that I mind too much about, because I think I agree that, you know, we need to cooperate with France. Macron made a big point in his speech about how this is a start, but it's not just an England or UK France thing. This is, you know, the UK EU, works with the EU and EU with France, which is automatically highlighting things that Sunak wouldn't want him to highlight. So all of these things are kind of potentially denting Sunak amongst the remaining voters that the Conservatives have, which constitute 4 guys from rugby somewhere. but it's not top page of the news because Gary Lineker has been removed from Match of the Day.
But then I do think also, because yes, clearly the government wants Gary Lineker to be the headline, because then the headline's not the government. But despite the fact that Gary Lineker's not the government, and so therefore they've escaped, you know, the headline tomorrow morning would have been the 500 million. Instead, it's Gary Lineker. But I think the Gary Lineker thing still does throw a lampshade around the government to a degree that they'd rather it hadn't happened at all, I suspect. And Suella Braverman certainly doesn't come out of it looking at all good.
Well, Braverman, did you see that she said she was offended because her husband is Jewish?
Oh, not only that, did you see what she said about her husband being Jewish?
Yeah, on top of it, I was going, because I think she said the rhetoric was anti-Semitic, wasn't it? And going, okay, the Board of Deputies also said they find this kind of worrying. So are you calling the Board of Deputies anti-Semitic here?
And this was the thing that I found really curious. She said that because her husband was Jewish, so this was nothing to do with, so the way it was phrased didn't make it personal to like a specific lineage, but she said that, and this is the quote, because my husband is Jewish, my children are therefore descendant directly from people who were murdered in the gas chambers in the Holocaust. No, not from a person, but from people. And this was because her husband was Jewish. Does that mean that Suella Braverman thinks that everybody who's Jewish is descended from somebody who died in a gas chamber?
Well, we don't. I don't know. I don't know about the ancestry of her husband.
No,
but there's a
it's
good chance.
Very strange way to phrase it.
There's a fair chance if she said that, because otherwise you get into Santos territory in America, who did claim to be descended from survivors of the Holocaust and turned out not to be. So I'd imagine Braverman is quite careful about that because her husband's lineage. I can understand why she points to her children as being descendants of that, because her children are a combination of her and her husband. So she's got, if it's just her husband, yes, she has an emotional connection, but this is actually a physical,
it's a family
blood
thing,
connection.
Yeah.
But the fact that she's brought up the Holocaust suggests that they're perfectly happy to escalate this Lineker debate. They're quite happy with what Lineker says. I don't think there's a chance that Lineker's so popular in the country this might dent the Tories, but I don't think the Tories are worried about their popularity in the whole of the country. They're trying to shore up their base. And so Lineker saying this is just feeding. I don't blame Lineker for saying it. Lineker's perfectly free to say it, and he didn't say anything too dramatic. I think it's telling that Braverman is escalating it. She's kind of magnifying it.
The telling thing was the first people to invoke the Nazis were the Daily Mail.
Yeah. Well, Lee Anderson, right?
Oh, it's the Mail headline, and he retweeted that.
Yeah, I think he'd already. He may have already said it, but yeah.
Yeah, and this is also at the same time that Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages are coming out, and there are more of those to come out. So this is a time of like very, very
battening down the hatches,
and that in itself is threatening their base as well, because their base is kind of lockdown skeptic, but they're sort of wavering. And
it's sort of disseminating a bit, isn't it?
So they're looking for chinks in Matt Hancock's rationale and the government's rationale in order to sort of. It's a really complicated situation, because actually with the Matt Hancock stuff, I'm kind of on Matt Hancock's side in terms of what he did, because I had no problem with lockdown. I think it was a sensible policy. The vaccines were a sensible policy. I don't think they locked down early enough, so I'm kind of keeping an eye on that. I mean, he expresses himself in a terrible way on his WhatsApps, but then he wouldn't imagine that a journalist would then release them later.
Well, and who doesn't, let's be honest.
No. So I'm not on Matt Hancock's side, but his sort of policies I'm inclined to agree with. It's people on his party and his wing that was more likely to disagree. So they're in a very perilous situation where this could blow up. And so they talk about Lineker, and the longer Lineker is on the front page. And they're talking about David Attenborough as well, but that's a red herring as well.
Oh, yes. That was never due to be broadcast on BBC One.
Yeah.
The episode in question of the Wild Isles thing. I
mean, if Attenborough had been affected by this, that, I think, would have gone down really badly in the country, because he is the BBC. I mean, he's like,
elder statesman.
Yeah, I mean, he was
ex-controller,
ex-controller, creator of BBC Two. But yeah, so that's my view. Is it's just one in a long line of trying to find a wedge issue or a scapegoat or something for the newspapers to report on, which isn't scandal or failure or humiliation.
Does it amount to, and I say this relatively lightly because I appreciate this is not by any stretch of the imagination at the kind of level where most people would start using this language. But given what the Home Office did about the video of Suella Braverman refusing to apologise to the Holocaust survivor, was it Holocaust survivor or it was Holocaust survivor rather than Holocaust survivor?
Child of a Holocaust
refugee.
It might have been child of Holocaust survivor.
Yeah.
So the Home Office tried to get them to remove that video, and in the end, the compromise was that the entire conversation was released, wasn't it? Is this state censorship? Because all these other people are allowed to do this, and it's not that the state themselves have directly removed Lineker from Match of the Day, on the understanding that in order to come back, he'd have to recuse himself from tweeting his political opinions. But there are Conservative Party members at the top of the BBC whose job it was to go in there and sort this out. So if it's the case that he's been removed until he does that constitute a kind of state censorship?
I don't. Bear in mind, there's a long history of the government trying to interfere with the BBC. It goes back, I think, to Churchill and General Strike. It is really well detailed in David Hennig's book on the BBC. And it does skew mainly to the Tories because obviously they've been in power, but obviously you then run into the Alistair Campbell, Dr. David Kelly stuff. I think what it raises is that the important appointments to the BBC are made by the government, and it's supposed to be this impartial news organisation. So surely at that point, you should be making these appointments a cross-party issue rather than simply, the gift of favour to your supporters.
It's also complicated because there's the chairman who's chosen by the government, but the director general that isn't necessarily chosen by the government, but the chairman has a say in the director general's appointment. But the director general, the history of the BBC seems to have been director generals tend to be slightly onto the left, whereas the governors tend to be slightly on the right.
And Marmaduke Hussey was extremely on the right.
Yeah, so Marmaduke Hussey. So the 1980s were when I remember this really becoming like the Falklands and the IRA impacting.
I know.
But I don't think this is state censorship because it's more complicated than that. Because Lineker's allowed to say what he wants privately. So nobody's disputing he's allowed to say what he wants privately. If he was allowed on Match of the Day, he would be talking about football. So they're censoring him talking about football. If he started talking about politics on Match of the Day, I think I would be inclined to agree that he probably. At this point,
I would say the BBC's coverage of the World Cup started with a discussion of the issue of Qatar and its the practice.
But this is essentially what it boils down to: is you shut your mouth or you lose your job. That's censorship.
It's bullying, certainly. I'd go with.
It's complicated. They're not kind of trying to control what he says on the television, though. On the BBC, they're trying to.
No, but they are trying to control what he says in a public space, and it is his private public space that they're trying to control.
Yeah, potentially.
And so
the Qatar thing is slightly different because
it was an agreed statement, and it was also something that was part of the news coverage anyway. Yeah. So he wasn't out of line.
Alex Scott also wore. I think it was the rainbow armband as a political gesture on there as well. So she actually did make it, and she's still allowed to broadcast.
I want to just have a quick word about Godwin's law, because it's kind of become one of these things now, one of these expressions that I think the right are kind of co-opting it to use it as a defense mechanism. In other words, you're not allowed to say anybody's behaving remotely badly, because as soon as you invoke anything to do with Germany, Godwin's law, and you've automatically lost your own argument. But I mean, at what point are you allowed to invoke Germany? Because there are dozens of examples now of this government behaving much like that government did. And as you've said, historians have pointed out that this government are behaving and using the sort of rhetoric of what that government did. So at some point, you've got to be allowed to make the comparison, haven't you?
You're allowed to. There's no problem. I mean, you talk about the language. Was it David Cameron was the first one, I think, to refer to a swarm of migrants. So it goes back a long way. It's the question of the rhetoric. It is that kind of language. It's othering people. It's othering human beings to try and make them seem like this just inhuman mass. It's exactly what was happening in Germany in the 20s and 30s.
But from the current government's perspective, there are two sides to it. The first is that sort of language works to fire up a particular tranche of voters.
Just as it did in the 1930s, right?
And secondly, the left's or the general reaction to that on places like Twitter, that works for them as well. So it's kind of they're not going to stop using this language if both the language itself and the criticism of the language works in their favour.
I think you could even go back 2005, maybe. Was it Michael Howard's campaign was, "Are you thinking what we're thinking?" You know, the subtle nudge of the wing, and it's just grown less subtle since.
Yeah.
Well, this is the big problem. Like Matt says, both sides of the argument play in favour of, sort of the far right and the encroachment of fascism, for want of a better expression.
I think as well, you talk with the power of language. It's almost like they're trying to almost defuse the power of the word Nazi. So, it's a word that people automatically turn off at. Again,
oh, absolutely. That's what I mean about Godwin's law. Originally, Godwin's law was just not about how you used it, but about the fact that I think the original Godwin's law was whatever conversation you're having, if it turns to politics, eventually it would get to the Nazis.
Yes.
And it didn't say whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. It just said that was an ultimate destination of any conversation, if the conversation went on long enough, I guess. But now that's been co-opted into a defense mechanism. As you say, all you do is, if you're on the far right, is say, well, I'm not a Nazi.
But it's also about the incrementalism of Twitter and Twitter arguments, because Twitter arguments don't tend to end with somebody saying, oh, yes, you're right and I'm wrong. Let's move on. They tend to increase. And so Gary Lineker could say you're using language like Germany did in the 1930s, which isn't accusing them of being Nazis. But it's on the road to doing that. And so the path of that argument is going to end with Nazis. And it's surprising how many arguments on Twitter about Doctor Who, about Star Trek, about whatever, end with somebody being accused of being like the Nazis. And I think it's that kind of extreme. I think there is an extreme with the kind of the resorting to, well, that's what the Nazis did, which just deadens the argument and stops it being a debate.
I do think we live in worrying times. The rise of populism really is like the rise of figures like Franco and Mussolini and Hitler back in the 1930s.
I think there are parallels.
Sure. I don't think it's going to end up in the same place. I don't think it can, because that's a lesson we learned.
History doesn't repeat, it rhymes is kind of the phrase, I think.
But you've got to ask, where will this end up? Because, I mean, let's not put too fine a point on it. With their back to work sort of policies and their sort of, all the things that they've done about disabled people, there is blood on this government's hands. Not this particular iteration of this government, but do you know what I mean? The othering has turned to bloodshed.
There's no substantive achievement to this government yet. Not from, you can maybe go, oh, the COVID thing, but the easiest thing to do to actually help sort the refugee crisis would be to actually sort out the backlog in the detention centres.
Well, but that's where some of that 500 million should have gone, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. They've stripped the state. Was it? I think there was one, the progressive economics or something to that name. Think that austerity stripped out £500 billion from state investment.
Yeah.
That's why everything's gone. And then again, you want to distract from that.
So at the moment, Sunak's been slightly more successful. Well, he's been more successful than Truss, in that he's remained in office for longer than a month. He's been more successful than Johnson because he hasn't been inflicted by massive scandals.
But then he's had Johnson hadn't either at this point in his, so that's a difficult comparison to make as well.
At the moment, Sunak's comparatively doing fairly well. So he's done reasonably well at the moment with Northern Ireland. He's actually made a progress with there, though it might fall apart.
I think that's the problem. The might fall apart thing is,
So, but at the moment, what's going to happen, the question what's going to happen is Labour's going to get into power in a year and a half. That's the likelihood of what's going to happen based on what's out there at the moment, unless Sunak can start achieving things.
Yeah. Any final thoughts on this then before we go? John, have you got anything final you want to throw into the mix?
I mean, this for me, it's all about essentially David Cameron, when he was in office, he just simply backed off when the right wing of his party confronted him. And again, they don't back down. They keep demanding more and more. And this is just, again, all in a line with what they want. It needs a Conservative Party to sort itself out, really. But I don't see that happening at the minute.
It's been taken over by the far right, really, hasn't it, at the moment?
Absolutely.
Ever since, I still think it all stems back to sort of Farage and Johnson and the sort of the way they turned the way the country thinks, sort of 5-10 years ago. I think all the things that are happening now have kind of got their roots in that kind of thinking back then. I mean,
it's a whisper in the ear, yeah.
Yeah, I'm obviously generalising to a massive extent, but I do think this country turned a really dark corner back in
When I was talking the other day, it was someone put it down to the bigot gate thing with Gordon Brown. It's like he wasn't allowed to say that woman had expressed bigoted views. Gillian Duffy.
Yeah, that's right.
And yeah, that kind of mainstreams it a little.
That's true. Well, when the owners of the press, let's not go there. Anything more you want to add, Matt?
Kind of. I think it sort of shifted slightly in a better direction because the populists have sort of been sidelined in part.
A little,
or the Johnsonian populists. But yeah.
I mean, the problem is you've still got people like Braverman around, haven't you?
At the moment,
and Francois.
At the moment, the far right aren't in control. They are. The Sunak's trying to appease them first. He's trying to shore up their support because Johnson leaving he doesn't have the support of that branch of the party particularly.
Well, clearly,
and he's spending all of his time. The government's spending all of its time trying to shore up the support of the bare minimum of votes that they're going to need for the next election. They're a long way. And in the meantime, Keir Starmer, boring as he may be, has quietly restructured his party and has very methodically kind of ticked off all the stages to becoming electable again. And now he's slowly unveiling these kind of, is it five policy areas?
Yeah.
And he's slowly he's just, on mission, just revealing what his policy ideas are.
Well, and I think on that point, it's not just that he's revealing things. He seems to be revealing things to a timetable, doesn't he?
Yeah.
In order to make Labour at their most electable in the autumn of next year, which is presumably when the general election will happen. But I also think it's not just policy that he's sort of timetabling. I think it's his party's personality that he's trying to timetable as well. I don't know whether I'm giving him too much benefit of the doubt here, but it strikes me that he's deliberately holding back on stuff that would appeal to the party faithful in order that he can sort of make Labour a party for everybody by about the back end of next year.
I think what he's doing is what I always think you should do in job interviews, which is act like you've already got the job when you're talking about the job. If you pretend you've already got the job and act like it, then they're more likely to give you the job. And he's appointing Sue Gray. He's starting to prepare the Labour Party for government, and he's started talking like actually he's the one that's in more control than Sunak is. And he's been doing this since the fag end of Johnson Truss. It's just the Labour Party aren't just trying to get elected. They're trying to act like they're the responsible party in control. And and it's working. People are responding, that people are talking about the Labour Party like they're the normal, that they're the ones in charge. They're talking about the Conservatives like they're scrabbling around for votes, like they're in opposition.
And you can see it by the way that so many MPs are finding other jobs or leave, deserting sinking the ship.
Yeah.
I just should be. The last thing I want to say really is it's really beautiful that this has blown up over a show where you're essentially watching lots and lots of immigrant workers.
Yes, basically. Nicely done, John. Right, one final question for the pair of you. There are 3 of us on this one, which means that Skype will have arbitrarily made one of us the one who's bigger on the screen and put the other 2 in the smaller parts of the screen. So until I've downloaded the video, we're not going to know who's the big one. John, would you like to take a guess? Is it going to be you, Matt, or me?
I'm going to say it's going to be Matt.
Matt, who are you pointing the finger at?
Well, based on the who's of games or whatever, I'm going to agree with John because he's generally right.
Well, and I'm going to say, seeing as John's got the biggest space in his picture, that Skype will doubtless have chosen him and expanded the space beyond all reasonable limits. Until we do this again, I was JR.
I was Matt.
And I was John.
And we will speak again soon.